There, and thank you for tuning in to our webinar, Power and Control, the Dynamics of Domestic Violence. We had a bit of a technical difficulty at the beginning of this webinar, and so the first couple slides are cut out, so I am re-recording myself going through them, and then we'll cut into the live webinar recording. So that's why I'm going to be wearing two different outfits in this webinar. So the two people that you'll be hearing present in this webinar are myself. My name is Ariel Rose Fishkin. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the Community Outreach and Resources Coordinator at Humboldt Domestic Violence Services. You're also going to hear from Maribel America Hernandez, and she is a client advocate at Humboldt Domestic Violence Services. Just to start off, I wanted to give a little bit of an overview about Humboldt Domestic Violence Services and let you know what our core services are. We provide a 24-hour support line to the community, and the reason that we call it our support line as opposed to a crisis line or hotline is because it is not just for folks that are in the middle of a crisis. Our support line is for anybody who's at any stage in their healing journey, whether they're in an abusive relationship now or from their childhood, recent past, whatever. The support line is open for you. And it's also open for family members, friends, community members who may be aware of a situation where abuse is happening and aren't sure what to do. The support line is also open for you to call in and sort of consult with an advocate and get advice. We offer one-on-one peer counseling, and that sort of looks like somebody coming in on, we don't schedule recurring appointments, but once someone is a client with us, they can reach out anytime and get a one-on-one peer counseling appointment. We offer support groups with childcare. During normal operations, we have 2 support groups a week. We offer restraining order assistance with domestic violence restraining orders. Important to note that those are different than civil harassment orders. We specifically help with domestic violence restraining orders and not civil harassment orders. We also can't assist, unfortunately, with divorce paperwork, child custody paperwork, anything else like that. We also provide court accompaniment to folks for their domestic violence restraining order hearings. And once a client is established with us, that's something that we can offer. Of course, we offer referrals to community partners that offer services that are outside of our scope. We offer emergency food, clothing, and shelter, limited shelter for survivors as well and their families. Here on this slide, you'll see the number for the support line and the number for the business office. So the support line is going to be the number you'll call if you ever have any questions about what our most current services are, especially during shelter in place and COVID. As we know, businesses, their services change a lot. And so since things can change so rapidly, I encourage you, if you ever have a question about what services are currently available, give that support line number a call and they will know the most up-to-the-minute information. The business office is for business, obviously, and that includes if you have something you want to donate, if you are a person with the media, for example, working for a newspaper or something, and you want to talk to anyone in the organization, please call the business office. If you call the support line number, they'll refer you to the business office. So yeah, that is the support line number is the first step for any client to get hooked up with Humboldt Domestic Violence Services. So if you or anyone you know is in need of any services, please, please, please call the support line and see what we can do for you. Go through some definitions real quick before we get into the meat of the presentation. Domestic violence is defined as a pattern of behavior used by one person to maintain power and control over another. This includes behaviors that physically harm, arouse fear, prevent a partner from doing what they wish, or force them to behave in ways that they do not want. It includes the use of physical and sexual violence, threats and intimidation, emotional abuse, and economic deprivation. Intimate partner violence, essentially the same as above, but this is a term that we use exclusively to describe abuse between current or former intimate partners, which can include current or former dating partners, spouses, co-parents, etc. So that's important to differentiate for us, because for us, domestic violence can encompass a range of relationships, including between a parent and a child, between cousins, any sort of familial violence or violence of folks in a family living together, we call domestic violence. So how do abusive relationships start? This is the first slide of the meat of our presentation, and at this point, I'm gonna pass it on over to past me. Thanks, everyone. So abusive relationships oftentimes start just like any other. So they may feel just like a normal relationship to the person, the people that are in them. And obviously what constitutes a normal relationship looks different to everybody. And oftentimes at the beginning of a relationship that ends up being abusive, it might even feel better than normal to the people that are in them. Abusers can often be incredibly romantic and charming at first. That can look like showering their partner with gifts and affection, sort of telling them that they're perfect, really idolizing them, just an overabundance of romance generally. And you know, romance itself is not necessarily a red flag. You know, we're all familiar with the honeymoon phase of a relationship, but what's the issue is that this romance, in a situation where the relationship becomes abusive, the romance is generally being used to sort of distract from or to cover up otherwise concerning behavior. So it's important to know what that concerning behavior might be that may be being covered up by this sort of excessive romance. So what do we look out for? We call them red flags. I like this image of a red flag that says keep exploring, because that's kind of how I think of red flags. It's not necessarily an immediate like the relationship must end, this is definitely abusive, but any one flag should be an indication that you should keep exploring, as it says, that you should pay attention, keep analyzing and looking at what's going on in this relationship. So just a few examples of red flags that we see commonly is one partner idolizing the other. And so like I mentioned, you know, we all know in the beginning of a relationship, there's the honeymoon phase. It's normal to think our partner's perfect and not see any flaws, especially right at the beginning. But most of us know that that's just a phase in a relationship, and that when that ends, we start actually, you know, experiencing the challenges that come up in a partnership. And when one person is, when we're talking about idolizing, this is something that's going beyond just that initial sort of honeymoon phase. We're talking about something that feels almost obsessive. It feels like too much. One partner might feel overwhelmed by the amount of attention they're receiving and just sort of feel like their partner's really putting them on a pedestal to an unreasonable degree. And that can be a red flag because it may be indicative that you know, that one of the partners who's doing the idolizing is not really willing to see the full picture of their partner. They're hyper focusing on the things that they like, and sort of refusing to see anything else. And, you know, this will naturally become more and more of a problem as the relationship continues and some of those, you know, maybe less favorable things about their partner become unavoidable. So idolizing is a red flag. An irrational level of concern. So this can look like incessant calling and texting from one partner to another, behavior that, you know, you might consider normal if you didn't hear from someone in your family that you normally hear from in 24 hours and nobody knows where they are. A lot of calling and texting, maybe even calling the police, something that would be normal in like a missing person situation, but somebody might be doing this after not having heard from their partner in a couple of hours. Or even someone might tell their partner, I'm going to the movies with my friend. And so they know where they are, they know what they're doing, they know it's reasonable to not be receiving texts, and yet they become angry or upset when they're not receiving communication. And this is oftentimes justified as the person being concerned about their safety. And so it's an irrational level of concern that's just not proportional to the actual situation. And is really being used sort of to cover up the fact that they kind of just want to keep tabs on their partner and know where they are at all times. Always casting blame is one we see a lot. If we notice that somebody is really quick to blame anybody else in their life for for anything that goes wrong, basically, you know, they're always saying something, they're misunderstood at work, everyone doesn't, you know who they really are, and things are going wrong, but it's always somebody else's fault all the time. That's a red flag, because that type of behavior, while it may not be directed towards the partner initially in the relationship in that honeymoon phase, it can very quickly turn into the partner being the target of that casting blame. You know, it's normal in in someone who's, you know, reflective, to take some level of responsibility over the things that are happening in their life. You know, we normally hear someone say like, oh yeah, I guess I could have, you know, been a little more communicative, or maybe I was like late one too many times and that's why my boss, you know. So not hearing anyone express any willingness to take any accountability for things that are happening in their life, that is definitely a red flag. And that kind of is the case, you know, with any pattern of behavior that we're seeing somebody, any negative pattern of behavior that's always being directed outward at other people, just kind of taking note of that and realizing that if we're the person in that relationship, while it might not be directed at us initially, it's sort of inevitable that behavior will be directed to us at some point. And so, phone ringing next to me. Didn't think about what to do in that situation. So here I have on this slide a link to a full red flags list. This is something that I will send an email out to everybody after this webinar with some of the information that we have here, some PDFs and stuff. And so that'll be one that I include in there, but it's a really extensive list of red flags. Let me make sure I hit the... So, okay, yeah, so while red flags are not necessarily abusive behaviors in and of themselves, they definitely can be, but what we're talking about is behaviors that are indicative of unhealthy patterns that may or will likely lead to abuse. And so, I skipped rushing to commitment. With rushing into commitment, this is very common in relationships that become abusive, where the abusive partner is really pushing for commitment during the honeymoon phase. And that's happening this push for commitment is happening before the other partner has like a chance to actually assess the relationship and assess whether it's a good relationship that they want to commit to. And when we think of commitment, like, of course, that can look like getting engaged, getting married, moving in together, sort of like legally binding commitments, and that definitely happens. But there's also sort of just like emotional commitment, where there might be a lot of talk about, I think we're soulmates, we're meant to be together, like we need to stick together forever, never leave each other. And so that's emotional commitment that, while it may not be legal or like binding in a physical sense, it's an emotional commitment that makes the stakes a lot higher for leaving the relationship. And so when somebody feels like they have this emotional commitment, they may think this person's their soulmate because this is the conversations that were being had during the honeymoon phase. It's going to be a lot harder to break out of that relationship, because you might feel like you owe it to that person to make it work, because after all, you're soulmates, right? So it's important, to just note that anyone who truly loves and cares about you will understand that you need time to trust, to learn about the relationship. And if there's a pressure to make some sort of commitment, then that's definitely a red flag. So now, as I said, wanting to move on to what these red flags may be indicative of to come. So I will pass it over to Maribel, and she will talk about the power and control.
Hi, so the power and control will, we as advocates actually use this a lot. So the reason that abusive people hurt people that love them, they usually have a desire or need to have a sense of power. They gain this sense of power by exerting control over another person. This is why we say that abuse is about power and control. There are different tactics and forms of abuse, but what they all have in common is that they're being done to exert this power and control. And so we'll talk about some common forms of abuse. Ariel, do you mind hitting the next slide? Thank you. So using intimidation, the abuser uses intimidation to keep their partner afraid or coerce their partner into behaving a certain way. Intimidation might be physical, such as destroying property, hurting pets, showing their weapons, threatening with weapons, but it can also be more subtle, for example, using certain gestures, looks, or actions. You can hit the next one. So for emotional abuse, insults are a very common form of emotional abuse. The abuser might call their partner names, telling them they're bad at something, and just anything to lower their partner's self-esteem. You've probably heard the term gaslighting, which is when the abusive person undermines, questions, or denies the reality that is being experienced by their partner. In gaslighting, the abusive person might deny something that's happened, such as, I never said that, or I didn't do that. It might also sound like you're exaggerating what happened. You're being too sensitive. I'm just joking. If you haven't experienced gaslighting, it might sound confusing, but imagine if someone you care about told you every single day that the things you thought and felt didn't make any sense. After so much time, you start to think, maybe I am crazy, or maybe my thoughts and feelings don't make any sense, and you start to doubt your very own judgment and perception. So for isolation, it can be to overt control, such as saying you can't hang out with this person, but it can also be subtle. An abusive person might insult or put down certain people in their partner's life to manipulate that person and convince them to stop spending time with that person. They might accuse their partner of choosing others over them and question why they would rather spend time with others. In this relationship, someone might come to the conclusion that it isn't worth it to try and see others because it always results in an argument, and this is where we see that separation from friends and family. For minimizing, denying, and blaming, this is a form of emotional abuse, and much of what it constitutes is gaslighting. The abuser may say it wasn't as bad as their partner is claiming. They might deny certain things that were ever said or done, or alternatively, the abuser might tell their partner that it's their fault, or I wouldn't get so angry if you just did this and this. So that's kind of what that sounds like. So for using children, an abusive partner might threaten to take custody of the children to scare or intimidate the partner. This is also one of the common reasons that we see why women don't just leave their partners, because their children are a very important aspect of their identity. An abusive person might harass the other parent or otherwise intimidate them during child custody visitations and exchanges. And children might also be used to relay messages to the other parent back and forth. And I also think that using children as also a way for immigrant partners who are being abused, that's definitely a source of intimidation. Like, I'm going to take the children and deport you. So that's definitely something that we see. So for using economic abuse, some abusive partners might directly stop their partner from getting a job, or they also might subtly discourage their partner from working so that they become financially dependent. Things such as having a shared bank account as well can create financial dependence for a survivor. Some abusers might spend family savings without the consent of their partner or family, or possibly opening up credit cards in someone else's name. So for using coercion and threats, what this looks like is that it can take many forms that depend on individual situations. Abusers may threaten to leave or commit suicide, and that does scare the partner into staying with the abuser. I think we went through this one, maybe.
Yeah, sorry. I just noticed that I don't have the I guess I don't have the privilege slide, but do you just want to go through that one?
So for the original Power and Control Bill talks about male privilege, and this can manifest in a cisgender heterosexual relationship as the male partner using gender roles to justify his behavior towards gender roles. Traditional gender roles in the US can be generally stated as the woman being expected to be subservient. Man works and woman stays at home. Woman cooks and cleans for her children and her husband. These things might be demanded of a woman in a relationship, and that fact, in many ways, society has long condoned these gender roles, will make it more difficult for her to push back or state her own needs and wants. Of course, any form of privilege can manifest in a relationship. If one person in a relationship is transgender, the other partner can do things such as threaten to out them. Somebody might have certain accessibility needs and their partner may not, and could be in the position to threaten to withhold things, mobility aid, medication, that allows the partner to act with access needs to go about their life. And especially sometimes abusers are sometimes often the caretakers of their partners.
Thank you, Maribel. And then talking about, so you'll see with the power and control wheel here, and like Maribel said, this is something that advocates use as a tool in talking with survivors to sort of help explain and understand their experiences as something in the context of power and control, and not sort of just isolated incidents. And so you'll see that sort of physical and sexual violence are on the outside of the wheel here. I think that we typically don't explain these as much in these types of trainings, because I think that it's something that is generally more understood by folks to be abuse, and to be pretty clearly abuse, and the more insidious things that are on the inside of the wheel are what people oftentimes don't recognize as abuse. But just to sort of course, touch on the physical and sexual violence is definitely a part of a lot of abusive relationships. And so, physical abuse can include those sort of very, what we imagine: hitting, slapping, shoving, grabbing, pinching, biting, hair pulling, essentially, anything that is causing physical harm. And it can also include, like was sort of mentioned, denying a partner medical care, sort of forcing alcohol and or drug use. We also consider that physical violence. And for sexualized violence, in the context of a relationship, coercing or attempting to coerce any sexual contact or behavior without consent. And so sexual abuse includes, but is certainly not limited to, marital rape, attacks on sexual parts of the body, forcing sex after violence has occurred, or treating someone in a sexually demeaning manner. Maribel mentioned in the chat too, an example of physical abuse would be driving recklessly with the partner in the car, because it's, you know, it's a threat to their physical person. It's causing them, causing or potentially causing harm or danger. So, you know, we also don't, if somebody is trying to cause someone physical harm, but they don't succeed, we would still consider that physical abuse because it's an attempt to hurt them in that way. Let's see. So the next slide is, so now that we sort of have a basic understanding of some of the tactics of abuse that we're seeing, I wanted to talk about the cycle of abuse. So I chose this one. I like the, there's a lot of these out here, you know, if you just do an internet search for cycle of abuse, power and control wheel, you'll see a lot of different versions. This one's a little outdated in terms of the terminology, saying batterer. We don't, we use the term abuser generally. And we usually say survivor as opposed to victim. Victim is more reserved for as a legal term these days, but I liked the level of detail that it had here, so that's why I chose this one. So this is the cycle of violence, and it generally starts off with, you'll see over here in the acute explosion, that's the incident of violence. And so it can be, as we said, physical or sexual violence, but it can also be an incident of emotional abuse. So it's, you know, it's that moment of harm that happens within the relationship. And the response, there can be a lot of different responses, of course, by the survivor, generally involving protecting themselves, maybe fighting back, maybe leaving, maybe trying to calm the abuser or trying to reason with them. And then after the acute explosion of violence, we have what we call the honeymoon phase. And it's not always, you know, not always doesn't necessarily feel like a honeymoon. It's not necessarily like a great time, even though it's called the honeymoon phase, but it's the period after the incident of abuse where the batterer is, you know, at least somewhat nicer. They might apologize. They might, you know, it might rise to the level of begging for forgiveness. They might make promises that they're going to go to counseling, they're going to get help, saying they'll never do it again, and just things to sort of bring the survivor back into the relationship. But it also can, you know, some abusers don't beg for forgiveness, they don't apologize, but this period will be one where they're being kinder because they've like had this explosion, and they might feel some guilt, so they're less harsh on their partner, and the partner might feel like just relief that the abuse is over for the moment. So you have a period of calm, and then afterwards the tension starts building again. So the abuser will be, you know, start getting moody, start nitpicking, withdrawing affection. They might start, you know, belittling their partner, and some emotional abuse might start happening again. But it's not escalated to a full incident. But the survivor feels that it's coming. They feel that this tension is building. They get this feeling that they're walking on eggshells. They might try to reason. They might, you know, just try and do whatever they think the abuser wants them to do, or whatever the abuser says they want them to do, in order to try and prevent another abusive event from happening. But eventually, within the cycle of violence, the tension will build to a point where there will be another acute explosion, and the cycle will continue from there. And I think it's important to note that usually survivors are they're aware of a cycle within their relationship. But the nature of abuse is just very disorienting, very hurtful, very upsetting. And so while there's an awareness of the cyclical nature of what's happening, and I think in an inherent way, there's not this sort of like clearly laid out, like, I understand what the cycle is within my relationship. And that's really the power of these tools, the cycle of violence and the power and control wheel, is it lays out these things in a way that shows the survivor that what's happening to them is within a pattern. You know, the fact that there's a whole chart on it, they're like, oh, of course this isn't just me, you know. If there's a whole philosophy behind why this is happening, it helps them see that they're not alone. And so that's why these tools can be really powerful. It gives them a framework to understand. I do see the question in the chat about, yeah, we will answer that at the end. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact on a survivor of experiencing ongoing abuse. Of course, with physical abuse and with sexualized violence, there can be chronic pain as a result of injuries sustained, and there can be a need for ongoing medical treatment. So that's something that can be with a survivor for the rest of their life. There can also be what is sort of emerging in the field of trauma studies. It's not officially a diagnosis in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. So it's not necessarily something that psychiatrists are diagnosing people with, but we refer to it as complex PTSD. And so PTSD being post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's essentially, we're seeing some symptoms that are aligned with the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, but the difference is often the cause. So rather than there having been, often with PTSD, we think of war, we think of soldiers returning from battle, we think of people who are in really violent, like incredibly tragic accident situations, which is definitely a cause of PTSD. But with complex PTSD, we're looking more at things that, if they did just happen once to a person, wouldn't necessarily cause trauma or PTSD, but so they don't rise to a certain level of severity, but they end up causing PTSD-like symptoms because they're prolonged to these incidents over time. And so that can be, this has been something that's really affirming for some survivors, because survivors have been having PTSD-like symptoms, having flashbacks, and, not being able to sleep, things that are normally seen with PTSD, but because of what is generally understood to cause PTSD, they weren't fitting into that diagnosis. And so complex PTSD has been a way to explain that prolonged exposure to emotional abuse, even if there's no physical violence, can cause PTSD, essentially. Some of the most notable reported symptoms of complex PTSD are emotional dysregulation and distorted self-perception. Emotional dysregulation can kind of just generally look like struggling with experiencing and controlling one's emotions. It can result in sudden changes in affect or emotion, or sudden outbursts of anger. Can also cause a distorted self-perception, which often comes directly from the influence of the abuser. A survivor may have endured endless emotional abuse, ranging from outright insults to more subtle manipulation, and this can lead them to genuinely believe that they are completely unlovable, and that they don't have worth as a human being, which, is understandable when someone has been continually told that, and they're also treated a certain way for so long. Something I've heard survivors say before is, well, I must have done something wrong, because why else would this person treat me so terribly? Because they're not an abuser. They can't imagine treating someone with such cruelty that doesn't deserve it. And so their way of that distorted self-perception comes about as a way to try and make sense of what they're experiencing, basically. General confusion and self-doubt is super common in survivors of emotional abuse, because the nature of emotional abuse, as we talked about, makes the survivor doubt their own thoughts and feelings. They're constantly being told, you're crazy, you're too sensitive, nobody else but me cares about you or loves you, and you're the cause of these things that I'm doing to you. And these statements often directly contradict the survivor's own experience. The survivor's insulted, and they try and express to their partner that, what you're saying hurts me, and they're being told, no, you're too sensitive. So the intuition that's calling the survivor to speak out about what's happening is constantly being undermined by their abuser. And so that sort of leads to a situation where the survivor starts to doubt their own intuition, understandably, because it's being questioned constantly by this person that's supposed to love and care about them. And when someone is doubting their intuition, which is the very foundation of what allows us to make decisions as we navigate through the world, you can imagine that making any decision, especially big decisions, becomes incredibly difficult. And survivors can be going through like extreme turmoil, just trying to make sort of decisions that we might consider basic decisions, because they don't know what internal or external compass to base making decisions off of. Survivors often develop coping strategies that help them survive and be safe physically and emotionally while in an abusive relationship, but now outside of an abusive relationship, these coping strategies are maladaptive. So we might look at a survivor who is lying a lot. They're hiding their emotions, they're not sharing what's happening, being secretive, and things that basically kept them alive in their relationship. But now that they're out of that relationship, they're talking to you, their friend, their family member, they're not just immediately ceasing that behavior because it's something that they learned to survive. And so the reason that I want to emphasize all of these impacts is to understand, obviously, what a survivor is going through, but also to understand as allies, friends, family members that, supporting a survivor after they've left a relationship or while they're still in it can be an emotionally frustrating experience because of directly the effects of the abuse. And so we have to understand, as people who want to support survivors, why they're exhibiting behaviors that to us might seem frustrating and confusing, and we don't understand why they don't trust us, and we don't understand, and so it's just really important that we work to understand the origin of behaviors that we're seeing that we feel like we don't understand, so that we can best support them. So I want to pull up, I think I just have it up already, a story, because I think it's great to hear just survivors talk directly about their own experiences. So we're going to go ahead and listen to this person's experience.
My name is Jenny. So I met my ex-husband in high school. We were together for about 5 years before we got married, with me knowing the entire time that this was a pretty unhealthy relationship. But because I became pregnant, we ended up getting married right after I graduated from college. And then we were married for 3 years before I was able to leave. Very early into our relationship, I noticed that he was pretty controlling. And so that controlling, jealousy kind of aspect of our relationship was present from the beginning. I processed it as he loves me so much, and wow, he really wants to be with me all the time, and really feeling like, I guess, important to him. And that felt really good for me to feel important to somebody, because I wasn't necessarily getting that in my home life. He threatened to take Dalton from me, that he would have a better lawyer, he had more money, And I really had nothing. You know, Dalton was at that point was my reason for living. Like, I didn't have much else to hold on to, and the thought of not having him was pretty terrifying. I was torn, like, is it the alcohol or is it him that's so violent and so mean? And so I gave him an ultimatum that either you stop drinking or I leave. And then he came up to me and with both of his hands and put them around my neck, pushed me up against the wall and made it very clear that I was not leaving. And so I began kind of just taking cash withdrawals when I would go to the grocery store for very small amounts, like 10 or 15 or $20, getting cash back, and then setting that money into a tin can that was above the kitchen cabinets to kind of start to plan to leave. I planned it when he was working at night, and he left about 4:30, I think, and I immediately started packing up my small car and drove to my best friend's house and kind of prepared for the wrath that I knew was coming. I'm so lucky. I never imagined that my life could be this great. I have an amazing husband who is just my angel. I'm so incredibly lucky to have him. And I have two amazing boys, and my oldest son Dalton is, well adjusted and the kindest human being. And so I'm so grateful that I had the strength to lead his dad. Being a part of Tessa now on the board has really, it's interesting to watch your life come full circle. Because of Tessa, I've been able to share my story and be more open with people about what my life was like before and what my life is like now. I'm just so thankful that Tessa is here for women who are in the same position that I was in, and it, to know that you're there for people who really need them and, are able to provide that support and that financial assistance, and just to be there for people who have no one else and feel like there's no other way to live life, for you to be that kind of shining light to show them that there's light at the end of the tunnel and there's hope and that you can do this, but we're here to help you and we'll support you. I'm very lucky that my husband and I co-own a business. It's a dream to be able to work with your best friend every day. And so, yeah, it's a really great life.
Okay, so if folks can just share in the chat things that you heard in her story to answer this question. What situations existed that allowed her to leave? Yeah, so that her abuser had a job that was out of the home. Absolutely. Being able to go to the store alone and withdraw cash. She had her best friend to go to. Hypervigilance in everything and mostly timing. Yeah, that planning. A safe place, yeah. So yeah, y'all said most of this. Access to money, allowing her to slowly save up over time. Even being able to withdraw those small amounts. Someone might be in a situation where they don't even have access to $10 at a time, like she did. Abuser worked an overnight shift, allowing a window for her to escape. Exactly. So, someone's abuser might not have a job. They might be at home all the time. Her best friend's house to go to when she left. She had a car. She was not physically dependent on her abuser, so she was actually able to, without the help of anyone else, pack up her car and leave. And so just considering, if these factors had not been present in her situation, would she have been able to leave? And these are things that a lot of us, if we have them, we, of course, take them for granted. And I think that's why a lot of times folks kind of end up saying like, oh, I don't understand why people just don't leave, because they're assuming that the survivor has access to everything that they have access to, which we know is, not the case for everybody. Just quickly, so touching on some barriers to leaving. Social minimization of abuse, like as we discussed earlier, there's sort of a normalization of abusive behavior that happens within our culture, especially when we're just talking about emotional abuse. And there can be a lot of relationships where there is physical abuse present, but it might only happen once a year or once every 6 months. And so the survivor can normalize staying because they're not considering emotional abuse to be abuse. They're only considering the physical abuse to be abuse, and they say, well, it only happens, so rarely that it's worth it. Fear of losing children. We saw this with the survivor just speaking. It's very common for abusers to threaten to kidnap children or say that they're going to fight for custody and win. An abuser may be very confident in saying like, I'm going to get the children from you. And as Jenny was saying, if that's really all they have, a survivor might determine that it's actually just worth it to stay in the relationship, because they see that as the best way to protect their kids. A lot of times survivors might be blamed saying, oh, well, they're not protecting, they're putting their child in danger by staying in the abusive relationship, which on some level may be true, but also realizing that in their head, they're thinking, well, if I leave and he takes the kids, then the kid is just with him or just with them, and I have, no way of protecting them. So they might determine that staying in the relationship is the most effective way to protect their child. Isolation, as we mentioned, a survivor may generally have no friends or family they can reach out to. The abuser may have created tension in the family that resulted in relationships being cut off, or perhaps the family of the survivor is also abusive and therefore unsafe. It's also pretty common for abusers to have their partner move with them to a new place. It might be out of a new city, a new state, a lot of times a new country that this is happening. And so when we say someone has no one to go to, we actually may mean that in terms of they might literally know absolutely nobody in the place that they live. Guilt. Survivors often feel a sense of obligation to help the abuser, especially if they've been together for a long time, or they have genuine love for the person. They feel like they want to stay so that they can help them, reform their abusive behavior. Or if the abuser is dealing with drugs and alcohol, they might feel a responsibility to help them get sober. The abuser might be in a position of power. They might be a judge, a police officer, or somebody else in a well-respected position. And in this situation, the survivor is likely to feel that nobody will believe them. And unfortunately, we see how often individuals come out against celebrities and the type of backlash that they receive. So it's not unreasonable. It's completely valid to not want to speak out about someone being an abuser when you know that they're a well-respected person, because you're almost certainly going to get backlash. So we have to understand that. Increased severity of abuse when leaving. Leaving is statistically the most dangerous time for survivors, because if the abuser knows that they're going to leave or suspects it, they generally ramp up their behavior because they feel like they're losing control, and they might act out in more violent ways. So that's another very real reason why someone might end up staying, even if they were on the verge of planning to leave. They feel the abuse ramp up. Lack of resources in the community. It's unfortunately pretty common for a survivor to not be able to find a place to go. Shelters are often full, and certain government assistance might not be available to somebody. And there's often multiple intersecting issues. I think it's important that we realize that a lot of survivors are not just dealing with domestic violence. They're also might have certain medical needs and need care. They might have substance abuse issues. They might have high level of care needs in terms of mental health. They might need to get on medication for something. And so finding a facility or an organization that can work with multiple intersecting needs is, especially if those needs are sort of severe, is difficult. It's difficult to find one place that can sort of wrap around and take care of everything that the survivor needs. So what can we do here? I'm going to show one more video, and it doesn't necessarily directly speak to domestic violence, but I want to show it, and I hope you'll understand the connection, and we'll talk about it afterwards either way.
There's a joke in my culture that we never smile in our family photographs. You see, there is no need to smile because a photo is merely a ritual we do in public, as if family is some sort of timeline that we're creating together. Today, my grandmother is turning somewhere between 84 and 86 years old. We do not know her actual age because when she was born, her father made up a date and put it on her birth certificate so she'd be more eligible for marriage. So today, we are celebrating the fact that my grandmother was born at -2 and still managed to survive. We spend hours deciding what to wear for the family photo. Grandma puts on an elegant black sari, and I put on a pair of jeans and a shirt, sit up a little bit straighter as the camera flashes, take record of this moment. Sometimes I think not smiling is an act of resistance. It's a way of acknowledging and documenting the silence that glues my culture together, like, do not mention that he prayed for a son and got hurt instead. Do not mention that he can no longer tell the difference between bottle and woman, these routine acts of violence, rendered invisible, that allow family to develop on the other side. I come out to my grandmother when I'm 18. There are no photos to document this event because you must understand, in my culture, coming out as a smile smudged on a family photograph, is an ocean swallowing us back, as all of our portraits tearing at the seams. It's not so much that we never speak about it, rather it's that the silence speaks for us. You see, in my culture, we learn from an early age that there is no difference between silence and violence. We inherit both from our men. My grandmother starts painting in her late 70s. When I watch her make art, I remember that this is the first time in her life that she's using her hands to make something for herself. Eventually, a pen and paper turns into a painting, and canvas turns into painting scattered across the apartment floor like a silent protest, turns into the person she sacrificed for woman, turns into what if, turns into too late. Sometimes she brings me next to her when she's naming her paintings. Today she holds up one she made from a sponge in the kitchen, says, "This is my rage." You have to understand, my culture requires an underground economy of rage, how we hate our men so much that sometimes we even hate ourselves for them and call it gender for short. You see, in my family, a child turns into a gender, turns into a marriage, turns into a mother, turns into rugrat, turns into repeat. I start wearing women's clothing when I'm 21 years old. And it's the first time in my life I can look in the mirror and not see the man I grew up terrified of staring back. Can I tell you what it means to wear an entire body as a wound? Can I show you what it means to watch a gender rewind itself? I put on a dress and turn into that photo of my grandmother in her 20s, turns into what if I tell her who I am, turns into leaving the house, turns into getting on a train, turns into a man pointing, turns into his questions, turns into his disgust, turns into him spitting on me, turns into an entire train laughing and doing nothing, turns into there's nowhere to escape in a moving train, turns into a beating heart, turns into running out of the next stop, turns into running to my grandmother's apartment, turns into her telling me that I dress this way to draw attention to myself, turns into her blaming me for my own violence, turns into me sometimes believing her, turns into gifting her man for her birthday. Look how carefully we document all of the violence that has been done to us in the name of gender. Today, my grandmother calls me the biggest disappointment in her life. I recognize this not as a form of my own gender oppression, it is hers. You see, I come from a long legacy of women punished by men who continue to push the man inside of me. How good it feels for the hurt to hurt someone else, I understand. In my culture, transgender is not just an identity. It is a tactic of survival. It is a journey to reclaim our hands from the men who steal them from us to do their work for them. It is a journey to reclaim our bodies from the genders who stole them from us. It is my grandmother's paintings. It is the first time in her life that her worth is evaluated by a man or a meal. It is me doing this for myself. It is the first time in my life that my worth is not created from all of the rage, so I refuse to call my grandmother transphobic. I will not blame her for her own violence. Instead, I will join her in not smiling in this family photograph. And there is solidarity in the silence. And there is resistance and a refusal to pretend we are both something we are not. Thank you.
Okay, so hope you appreciated that. That's a Alokvi Menon. So and I showed that there's a lot of, one of the through lines there is speaking of silence, and how at the beginning they say that silence is what happens to allow family to be created on the other side. And so recognizing the role that silence plays in allowing domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and any type of abuse to continue has us realize that the alternative and sort of the remedy is speaking. And I think when I watch Alok speak, I realize that the power that exists in them being able to speak out on the violence that they experience. And so as someone who wants to be an ally, as someone who if you have friends, family members, people in your life, you know, that are just closing violence to you, or that you suspect might be in a situation of violence, really my main recommendation is always to speak and allow space to speak. And so it may be as simple as, if you suspect that violence is happening in a relationship, just asking, you know, is everything okay? And whatever comes out after you start that conversation, just allowing that to exist and allowing that answer to be fully seen. And really, I always encourage, when folks are kind of wondering like what to do when a survivor is disclosing, I say, like, just sort of general active listening skills and are sort of the strongest thing. And practicing non-judgmental listening is probably one of the best things that you can do in a situation where someone is disclosing abuse to you. And also to familiarize yourself with community resources and know your own limits. So knowing that Humboldt Domestic Violence Services exists, knowing that North Coast Rape Crisis Team exists, knowing that Two Feathers Native American Family Services exists. Those are 3 services available specifically to survivors in Humboldt County. And so you're able to sort of easily direct people to what services are available to them when you do become aware that that someone is experiencing abuse. Maribel, pointed out in the chat here that the use of language, we often say focus on saying what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. And so not blaming an individual for what they're experiencing, but focusing on this is an experience that they have gone through, and it doesn't reflect their self-worth, and it doesn't mean anything bad about them as a person. Do you want to add anything, Maribel, besides that?
I don't know if you also mentioned this when we were talking about the power and control wheel, but the use of stalking in physical abuse. I think one thing that I've noticed is that we as a society, we now have Snapchat, Instagram, iPhones. So also just things when safety planning or something to think about is turning off your Snapchat maps or turning off your sharing your location. So I think that's also really important in our current society today.
Yeah, definitely. When you're talking to someone and they're worried about their safety, considering all different possibilities of how violence could happen or how stalking could happen. I want to do, a future webinar like this, but that is entirely focused on this portion right here, the like what can we do portion. So other than that, so we're just a little 5 minutes over time, but I just wanted to let you all know that we have 2 more webinars coming up immediately. Next week, we have how COVID-19 is changing the dynamics and patterns of domestic violence, and we're gonna be joined by North Coast Rape Crisis team on that one. And then the week after that, we're going to have a webinar titled "Sex Work is Work: Differentiating Sex Work from Human Trafficking." And this would be a good one for anyone out there who's had a lot of human trafficking, sex trafficking, labor trafficking trainings. This would be a really good supplement to sort of understanding more nuances within that realm. And I will also, like I said, with those PDFs, I'm going to send out this PDF, and the links on it will be clickable. So if you download it, you can register for those. And then also on the left here, we have a Father's Day pledge running on our website. And so, it's for fathers, for all the guardians and role models and leaders of the youth in our community. You don't have to be identify as male to take the pledge. And so you can look at our website there, hdvs.org/Father's Day, just covered it, /Father's Day Pledge 2020, and read through the pledge. And we hope that you will sign that and share it. So that is all I have. And so now I just want to open up if anyone has any questions. You can type them, or also feel free to just speak them at this point. I think you all are able to unmute yourselves. So, but if nobody has any questions, I'll give a minute for folks to ask.
Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question is in regards to restraining orders. Do restraining orders only specifically protect people that have been threatened physically or have had threats against them, or because I'm thinking about, like, if someone's just being stalked on, like, social media and, like, getting phone calls, like, up the wazoo, are there protections for that?
Do you want to speak to that, Maribel, or do you want me to?
As of my input, I don't know specifically, because law enforcement, when we do take clients in for restraining orders and stuff, the judge usually wants solid instances of abuse. Our definitions of abuse include emotional and psychological, whereas the legal definition of abuse is what they take into consideration. So based on our experiences, I think it is a little hard to get that restraining order filed if it is online, just because there are many ways of picking up extra phone calls or using these apps that hide your phone, like your phone number. So I think that's definitely something really difficult to navigate. Ariel?
Yeah, so when we as advocates are going through, let me see if I have I'm trying to pull up the right form. Maribel, which is the form that has where you actually put the incidents on it? Is it the 110?
There's one, the DB 100 has the 2, and then I believe it's the DB 109 that has the extra 2, where you can also describe. So the first form, DB 100, it asks for 2 instances of abuse starting with your most recent, and then that second form you can add more. And typically there, if they don't have any exact instances, what we'll do is we'll describe some of the types of abuse, like, oh, he goes to Facebook, or, oh, yeah, right there. So he also, he slams the doors when he walks around at an event to scare me. So just showing patterns of abuse is usually a really good cause and help for having the judge understand that, because they do read over this, but they have to be when we work with our clients, we make sure that they're very specific. That way the judge gets right away, okay, this is happening. Okay, this is enough cause for it to go through.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pull this up because you'll see here on the form, it defines what abuse is for the purposes of the court. So abuse means to intentionally or recklessly cause or attempt to cause bodily injury to you, or to place you or another person in reasonable fear of imminent serious bodily injury, or to harass, attack, strike, threaten, assault, hit, follow, stalk, molest, keep you under surveillance, impersonate, batter, telephone, or contact you, or to disturb your peace, or to destroy your personal property. So definitely within that definition, there are things that are not physical abuse that absolutely fall under some of this definition. And I think, yeah, it's kind of just a matter of, like Maribel was saying, really clearly explaining in the restraining order what's happening, so that, to give the judge basically the clearest picture of what's going on. So yeah, I would say, yeah, definitely things that do not, and especially if, there are things that are really genuinely distressing the person, it has here, if it's disturbing your peace, we have seen restraining orders be granted to folks where there was no physical violence. So it's always, with the court system, it's hard to say with any consistency what's going to happen or not. But just noting that, yeah, definitely within the legal definition, there are non-physical types of abuse that are recognized by the court as being rising to a level that would merit granting a restraining order. So I hope that's helpful.
No, yeah, it definitely helped. Thank you so much.
And again, if folks, if you know someone that is interested in a restraining order, calling our crisis and support line, which is there. We will go through the entire process of the restraining order with somebody and explain to them, because you need a certain amount of copies when you give it to the courthouse, and there's a certain way to everything about it. And so the advocate will go through the entire process with somebody. And yeah, as Maribel said, also very, like, a decision can depend on the judge that you have, as with anything. So it's important, I think, to be realistic with people about what they can expect with a restraining order. And it's not, and a lot of people choose not to pursue that route because they realize, they feel that based on their situation, bringing the legal system in will actually cause more harm. And so we always encourage the survivor to think about what it's going to entail and make a decision based on what they feel is the best option. And I know I guess wanted to touch back on the question that was asked regarding if there are any special protections or services specifically for undocumented immigrants. And as Maribel said in the chat there, we do have bilingual advocates that work with clients and assist in court accompaniment to lawyers, and possibly CWS meetings and with restraining orders. So essentially any of our services can be offered to Spanish-speaking clients. And then also specifically for that, there are specific visas for trafficking and domestic violence. Those are the U visa and the T visa. And just from my experience, usually if that's something that someone wants to explore, they're going to need a lawyer. And so that would probably be and specifically an immigration lawyer, ideally, which there's not, I haven't checked in a while, but for a long time there was no immigration lawyer here in Humboldt County. There may still not be, but so finding a lawyer who specializes in immigration is probably going to be the best bet for someone who's trying to seek special legal protections for being a survivor and being undocumented, especially in Humboldt County. Were there any other questions? Okay, I will, want to answer? Maribel, it was asked how many bilinguals, Spanish speaking staff we have. There's 3. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Mhm.
So usually staff during our usually we have during our prime business hours, we usually have a bilingual Spanish speaking advocate that's there 5 days out of the week. And then we also have another bilingual advocate that also within her shifts is also there for the more evening types. And then our Safe Haven director, she is also Spanish speaking and bilingual. And she has also personally worked with immigration. So she does definitely have some really good resources for that as well. And then our line is 24/7. So if an advocate isn't bilingual, you will usually give them a time when they should call to reach one. And then seminars, I think that'd be you, Ari.
Yeah, for that, asking if there's any specific to the LGBTQ plus population of survivors. Not that we have scheduled at the moment, but I do have a community member who asked to do a webinar about that topic. So that is something I'm sort of planning them in chunks of 3 at a time. So just keep an eye out, and that's one that we will probably have in the future. And especially since you mentioned it, I will make a point of it. And just want to emphasize too on that topic that our services are available for individuals of all genders. So we're not just for women survivors. So. If you have any other questions that come up, I'll put my email in the chat. You're welcome to email me any questions. And as I said, I will be sending out a list of some resources for folks that registered for this webinar, including information on future webinars. So I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for doing this with me, Maribel. And hope to see you all at the next one, which again is next week, same time, same day and time. And you can try to go to the end quickly, and you can register for it at this link there, which I'll send out. Thank you.